morning, everyone. My name is Hernani Tila. I work at the Safeguards unit of the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm just going to say a couple of introductory things. The IDB has been working with the World Conservation Monitoring Center out of Cambridge on a number of what we call knowledge projects to help bring business on board, as well as sort of streamline a little bit of our project cycle requirements. And we identified the need to cover, a growing array of voluntary, multi-stakeholder industry certifications and standards that are emerging over the last years. And from my perspective, I had kind of three objectives in the work that Matt Jones is going to present to you. One is I wanted to know where we are in terms of other leading MFIs, multilateral finance institutions, in their treatment of the biodiversity content of their policies and standards. Secondly, I wanted to learn more about what the extent that all those various standards out there comply with the core principles of safeguarding biodiversities. And thirdly, are there any gaps that we as a multilateral financial institution should be attempting to cover? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Matt, and then I'll just say a couple of things at the end. Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction. So I'm from the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. We are, as been stated, the biodiversity arm of the UN Environment Programme, effectively. And we did this project with IDB and with a few other organisations looking at standards and certification schemes and how they treat biodiversity. I'd like to go through some of our research with you today and just highlight some things, particularly about the finance sector. So first of all, the things I'll step through are looking at standards and certification schemes, looking at the fact they are a key mechanism for safeguarding biodiversity. I'm going to looking at actually how those standards actually treat biodiversity, and then we'll take a look at the finance sector in particular. So standards, they really are an important mechanism for safeguarding biodiversity. They're used widely across sectors to influence environmental and social performance. They're adopted by businesses for many different reasons. You heard Liz talk about a few of those earlier on. One of those in particular is access to finance, obviously, where an organisation wants to get access to finance from someone like IDB or IFC or any of the other development finance institutions or multilateral finance institutions. They're required to comply with certain performance requirements. Then we have things like certification of products and services, so for example FSC and MSC, looking at timber and fisheries products. And then finally membership of trade bodies, which confers things like legitimacy and a positive reputation for organisations. So standards, as well as having general environmental requirements, quite often include specific biodiversity requirements, and those criteria is where we focused our research. So we looked at a study of 36 environmental standards. The purpose was really to generate clear understanding of the treatments that biodiversity receives across a number of key sectors. And the idea of the output was to really highlight, as I said, some of the commonalities, but also some of the differences, some of the gaps that we find. So we looked at 36 standards. They came from 8 sectors. You'll see agriculture featured very prominently. Some of the agriculture standards, some of the oldest in the world. Also fisheries, forestry, and as I've mentioned, finance, as well as a few others. You'll note that some sectors had very few standards in, which obviously is important to bear in mind when looking at this research. One thing I will point out, there were no standards that complied with our criteria for what a standard was from the oil and gas sector, which we're actually quite surprised by. And thought we probably would find something, as we do in the mining sectors. So we based the review itself on the Convention of Biological Diversity. It seemed a sensible place to start. We looked at components of biodiversity first of all, how standards actually treat, safeguard and protecting the elements of biodiversity. So we looked at habitats, species, protected areas which are legally, nationally recognised, and also priority conservation areas, which are areas that are designated by other organisations, conservation organisations. So for example, Conservation International with their biodiversity hotspots, or WWF with ecoregions, BirdLife International with important bird areas. So these are areas without legal protection, but they have been identified by somebody as important priority areas for conservation. And then finally we looked at threats and biodiversity responses. So we looked at habitat loss and restoration specifically, invasive species, overexploitation, and then slightly separately we looked at mitigation hierarchies as they were included, where they were included, and the concept of no net loss or net positive impact, which are really a more framework element as opposed to the specific detailed elements that you see above. So how do those standards actually treat biodiversity? What did we find out? This is a high-level overview of the coverage of these issues within the 36 standards. So you've got up to 100%, for example, for habitats, a very high percentage, 94% for habitat loss and restoration, and also for species. But then we start to see things drop off. Protected areas are represented in about 85% of standards, but invasive species and overexploitation of species, we start to see much, much less coverage across the standards. And as you'll see, priority conservation areas get just about 40% covered within the standards that we took a look at. It's important to note at this point, we didn't look at the efficacy of standards particularly. We didn't look at how they were implemented, how they were audited. We looked at the sorts of treatment that biodiversity got. So the coverage here is an indication of were these issues included rather than are these issues well handled within each standard. So using these same axes here, I'm now going to show you a slide which has the sectoral coverage across them. So it's a little bit busy, but we're going to step through it nice and quickly. So you'll see each of the sectors represented, agriculture up there on the top. You'll see that agriculture complies with the average of the rest of our sample, as you might expect, as it has the greatest number of standards. But actually what's really interesting here is that even though there are some slight differences, some subtle variations, by and large, each of the sectors, the standards follow a very similar pattern to the entire sample that we took a look at. You'll see a few differences. So, for example, if you take a look at biotrade up on the top right, overexploitation is included in the standards that we looked at, as you would, to be honest, expect, because we're talking about biotrade, we're talking about trade and capture of species. Then in finance, for example, you see there's a big gaping hole when it comes to priority conservation areas, things like high conservation value or key biodiversity areas. They're not included currently within finance standards, although I will note that in the new IFC performance standard, which hadn't been released when we did this research, I think that KTV and KBA do actually start to feature. But by and large here, the message is that actually the coverage is equivalent. People are talking about the same issues normally across their standards. However, despite this similar pattern in the coverage, we've really found some very different approaches were being adopted. There were some significant differences, for example, in language and definition used. Very rarely were all the standards using exactly the same language and exactly the same definition when they're talking about what amounts to exactly the same issue. And in fact, within some standards, we found instances of one organisation setting several different standards for example, different species. And actually, they might use slightly different definitions in different documents for one organisation. Habitats are given the greatest overall protection, but that protection varies greatly across the standards, and the types of habitats that are treated also varies greatly across standards. We see forestry is given a significant amount of attention. FSC standard was, I think, developed in about 1989, 1991. It's not surprising that forestry is quite a big issue. However, we don't see the same sort of protection for aquatic environments, for wetlands, we don't see it for peatlands, for grasslands, and for other habitats. Requirements relating to species, as I said, species had a very high degree of coverage, but those requirements almost always focus on protecting their habitat, as you might expect. This is the normal way that conservationists treat protection species. But what's interesting is that there were some variations, there were a few outliers when we started to look at the way organisations were treating species in particular. Protected areas get a significant coverage, as you saw, 85%, and especially when you compare that to priority conservation areas, but they are greatly covered, they are not necessarily given a great deal of guidance on how a company should operate in different, for example, IUCN categories of protected areas, or depending on how close they are, or even if they're within a protected area. That guidance is typically missing from within standards. And then finally, the mitigation hierarchy is very rarely adopted within standards. That sort of framework element is quite often missing. It's a relatively new concept, so that's not terribly surprising.